She was a widow alone on the edge of the world, with only a stubborn heart and her late husband's rifle for company. One brutal dusk, that quiet life shattered. She witnessed a sight from a nightmare, a small Apache boy cornered by a ravenous wolf pack. Her choice was simple: stay safe in her cabin or step into the jaws of death for a child the world considered her enemy. But her act of desperate courage didn't bring peace. It brought war to her doorstep. That very night, the boy's tribe, a silent ring of painted warriors, surrounded her cabin in the dark. Was it a rescue or a capture? The Arizona sun bled out across the horizon, painting the Dragoon Mountains in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. For Abigail Hayes, this was the hour of ghosts. It was the time of day when the vast, aching emptiness of the territory felt most personal, when the silence was so profound it mimicked the ringing in her ears. It had been 14 months since she'd buried her husband Thomas under the lone mesquite tree that overlooked their claim. 14 months of speaking mostly to her 2 chickens and the stoic, sun-bleached skull of a long-horn steer she'd mounted over the hearth. Her life had shrunk to the size of this hard-won scrap of land, a sturdy one-room log cabin, a well that was more sweat than water, and a garden that was a daily battle against rock and sun. At 32, her hands were calloused, her face mapped by the sun, and her heart encased in a quiet, stubborn grief. She had refused to run back east to the pity of her family. This land, this cabin, it was the last tangible piece of Thomas she had left. To abandon it would be to bury him a second time. Tonight the ghosts were restless. A wind sharp and cold for late summer snaked down from the mountains, carrying with it a sound that prickled the skin on Abigail's arms. It wasn't the familiar howl of a lone coyote. This was a chorus of yips snarls and the guttural hungry growls of a wolf pack on the hunt. They were close. Too close. Abigail moved inside her hand instinctively, going to the Winchester rifle resting on its pegs by the door. She checked the load, a habit as ingrained as stoking the morning fire. Through the single glass pane window, she scanned the darkening landscape. The pack was a knot of fluid grey shadows, moving through the scrub brush about 200 yards from her cabin, near the rocky arroyo that carved a scar through her property. Her breath caught. They weren't chasing a rabbit or a deer. They had cornered something small at the base of a rock wall. At first, she thought it was a coyote pup, separated from its mother. Then the small figure stood up. It was a child, a boy no older than 7 or 8, his dark hair a stark slash against the pale rock. He wore only a breechcloth and worn moccasins. Apache. The lead wolf, a brutish male with a scarred muzzle she'd seen before, lunged. The boy scrambled back, a small, sharp cry, swallowed by the wind. He held a pitifully small stick, a useless ward against a dozen sets of teeth. Abigail's blood ran cold. Every instinct, every cautionary tale Thomas had ever told her, every whispered rumor from the nearest settlement in Tucson, screamed at her to bar the door and blow out the lamp. The Apache were a spectre hauntings this land. The Chiricahua, they called them. Ghost warriors who faded into the canyons, their raids, spoken of in hushed, terrified tones. To interfere was to invite a wrath she could not possibly withstand. He was not her kin. He was, by the harsh logic of the frontier, her enemy. But the boy cried out again, a sound of pure terror that bypassed logic and struck a chord deep in the hollowed-out part of her chest, where a mother's instinct lay dormant. He was a child, alone, about to be torn apart. "Damn it all to hell!" She whispered the words a prayer and a curse. She didn't think. She acted. Snatching the rifle, she grabbed the heavy iron shovel, leaning against the woodpile just outside her door. She didn't waste a shot. The light was too poor for accuracy, and she couldn't risk hitting the boy. She needed to make noise to be a bigger, more terrifying threat than they were. She ran her worn boots, pounding the hard-packed earth. "Get away from him! Get!" She screamed, her voice raw and unfamiliar in her own ears. The wolves turned their attention, snapping from their cornered prey to this new, charging menace. Yellow eyes gleamed in the twilight. The scarred male lowered his head, a deep rumble vibrating in his chest. Abigail didn't slow down. When she was 30 yards out, she slammed the flat of the shovel against a large boulder. The clang of iron on rock was an alien, deafening sound in the natural world. It echoed through the arroyo, sharp and violent. A few of the younger wolves flinched back, startled. She screamed again, a wild, primal sound dredged up from a place of fear and fury. She wasn't a widow. She wasn't a homesteader. She was a predator, staking her claim. The alpha took a step forward, then another, testing her. Abigail raised the Winchester to her shoulder, the cold stock a familiar comfort against her cheek. She didn't aim at the wolf. She aimed at the dirt just in front of his paws. The rifle cracked a tongue of flame, spitting into the dusk. Dust and pebbles flew. The wolf yelped and jumped back, the sheer concussion of the shot momentarily breaking his nerve. The rest of the pack already unnerved by the shovel's clang, and her screaming took their cue from their leader's retreat. They hesitated, a confusion of shadows, then broke apart, melting back into the landscape as silently as they had appeared. Silence descended once more, broken only by Abigail's ragged breathing and the keening whimpers of the boy. He was slumped against the rock wall, his small body trembling uncontrollably. As Abigail approached, he flinched, his dark eyes wide with a fear that now transferred entirely to her. He was seeing a white woman, gaunt and wild-eyed, holding a smoking rifle. To him she was just a different kind of wolf. "It's all right," she said softly, holding her empty hands out. "They're gone. You're safe." He didn't understand her words, only her tone. He stared at her, then at the rifle she carefully leaned against a rock. His gaze fell to his leg. A long, shallow gash ran down his calf, welling with dark blood, where one of the wolves had managed to nip him. It wasn't deep, but it was dirty. Abigail knew she couldn't leave him here. The wolves would be back, or the cold would take him, or his tribe would find him, see her tracks and assume the worst. The only chance either of them had was for her to get him back to the cabin. She took a slow step forward. "Come on, son. Let's get you cleaned up." He tried to push himself away, hissing a word in his own tongue that sounded like a curse. He was terrified, but there was a fierce pride in his eyes. Abigail sighed. There was no time for gentleness. She moved quickly, scooping him up. He was light, all sinew and bone, but he fought her, his small fists beating against her shoulders, his cries turning from fear to outrage. "I'm sorry," she grunted, adjusting her grip. He was a bundle of sharp elbows and writhing limbs. "I'm not hurting you. I'm helping." She half-carried, half-dragged him back towards the pinprick of light that was her cabin window. Every step was a struggle. The crying Apache boy, the smoking rifle left behind the darkening mountains. It was a scene of madness. She retrieved her rifle, never letting go of the child, and finally stumbled through her own doorway, kicking it shut with her heel and sliding the heavy wooden bar into place. The cabin was small, but in that moment, it was a fortress. She set the boy down on the braided rag rug near the fire. He immediately scrambled to the farthest corner, pulling his knees to his chest, watching her with the wary, hateful eyes of a trapped animal. His name, she would later learn, was Taza. And he was not merely the son of an Apache warrior. He was the only son of Nantan, the most feared and respected war chief of the Chiricahua in that region. He had been on a solo trial of courage, a vision quest to prove his readiness when he had been separated from his pony and tracked by the wolves. Abigail, of course, knew none of this. She knew only that she had a bleeding, terrified Apache boy in her cabin, a bolted door, and a growing sense of dread that coiled in her stomach like a cold snake. She lit another lamp, the golden light pushing back the shadows. She tended to the fire, her movements slow and deliberate, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. She tore a strip from a clean flour sack, soaked it in precious water from her canteen, and approached him. "Let me see that leg," she said gently. He flinched as she knelt, but the fight seemed to have drained out of him, replaced by a shivering exhaustion. She carefully washed the dirt and wolf saliva from the gash. He winced, hissing through his teeth, but he allowed it. She found a small tin of pine tar salve, Thomas's remedy for everything from cuts to splinters, and applied a thin layer before wrapping the wound with another strip of cloth. His trembling was worse now. The cold of the night was seeping into his bones. Shock. She pulled a heavy wool blanket from her cot and draped it over his small shoulders. He stiffened at her touch but didn't shrug it off, pulling the strange-smelling fabric tighter around himself. For an hour they existed in a state of silent truce. Abigail sat in her rocking chair, the Winchester now resting across her lap. The boy Tarza huddled by the fire, the blanket held tight, his eyes never leaving her. The storm of adrenaline and fear began to subside, in Abigail replaced by a chillingly rational question. What have I done? The answer came not from within, but from without. It started with the chickens, a frantic, muffled squawking from their coop, cut short, a sound of absolute finality. Abigail froze her knuckles white on the rifle. She stared at the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She heard nothing else. No footsteps, no voices. The silence that followed was heavier, more menacing than any sound. She rose, slowly creeping to the small window and peering through a crack in the curtains. The moon had risen, bathing the clearing in a stark silver light, and in that light stood the figures. They were not wolves. They were everywhere. Silent, motionless silhouettes, standing just at the edge of the light cast by her cabin. One stood by the well, another by the dead chicken coop, two more near the woodpile. She couldn't see them all, but she could feel them. They were a ring of death, a living fence drawn around her home. They held rifles and bows, their faces obscured by the darkness, some painted in patterns that seemed to float in the moonlight. They were not preparing to attack. They were simply there, waiting. The Apache had come for their boy, and she was trapped in the middle of them. The boy, Tarza, must have heard something too. He stirred, a soft moan escaping his lips. He looked from her face to the door, a dawning understanding in his eyes. Abigail met his gaze. The terror she felt was cold and absolute. She had not saved a child from the wolves. She had dragged a spark into a powder keg, and now the whole world was about to explode. The night stretched into an eternity. Every creak of the cabin's logs, every pop and spit from the hearth, sounded like a gunshot in the suffocating silence. Abigail remained at the window, a statue carved from fear, her gaze flitting from one motionless shadow to the next. They did not move. They did not speak. Their patience was a weapon more terrifying than any war cry. It was the patience of the mountain of the stone of time itself. It said, "We are here. We are not leaving. The next move is yours, and it will be your last." The boy Tarza had crawled closer to the fire. The initial shock had given way to a feverish delirium from the wolf bite. He shivered violently despite the blanket, and the fire's warmth, his breathing shallow and quick. He muttered words in his own tongue, his eyes glazed. Abigail knew infection. She'd seen it take men tougher than this small boy. She had whiskey good for cleaning a wound or dulling a man's senses, and some dried willow bark she could boil into a tea to fight the fever. But to do any of that, she would have to move away from the window, turn her back on the door. A floorboard groaned under her foot as she shifted her weight. Outside, a head turned, a single sharp movement in the sea of stillness. They were watching the cabin with an inhuman intensity, listening for any sign. They think I stole him, she realized with a fresh wave of panic. They tracked him here, found him gone, saw my tracks leading away. They think I'm a kidnapper, a killer. The dead chickens were a message. We can get to whatever we want. Her mind raced, sorting through impossible options. She could not shoot her way out. That was suicide. She could not wait them out. The boy would die of his fever, and her small supply of water wouldn't last 2 days. Her only hope was to communicate. But how the boy moaned again, a pitiful sound. Nana. The word was a crack in the armor of his pride. Mother. He was calling for his mother. That sound did what an army of warriors couldn't. It made Abigail move. All right, she whispered to the boy and to herself. All right. She laid the Winchester on the table, a deliberate act of non-aggression, though it felt like surrendering a limb. She moved to the hearth, her hands shaking as she hung a small kettle of water over the fire. She broke up the brittle willow bark and dropped it in. As the water began to warm, she dared another glance out the window. The shadows hadn't moved, but they would have seen the change in the firelight. They would know she was active inside. Suddenly, a new figure emerged from the darkness. He was taller than the others, and he moved with an authority that set him apart. He walked into the center of the clearing, stopping just beyond the reach of the lamplight, spilling from her window. He was not armed with a rifle, but held a single long lance, its tip glinting in the moonlight. Even at this distance, she could feel the sheer force of his presence. He was the leader. This was Nantan. His face, chiseled and severe, was unpainted. He didn't need war paint to inspire fear. His eyes fixed on her cabin door were dark pits of controlled fury and agonizing worry. Abigail's heart hammered. This was him, the chief, the father. She had to do something. Showing fear would be seen as guilt. Hiding would be an admission of wrongdoing. She took a deep, steadying breath, picked up the lamp from her table, and walked to the door. Her hand hesitated over the thick wooden bar. To slide it back was to invite them in. To leave it was to confirm their suspicions. He's just a boy, she thought, her gaze falling on Taza, now curled into a tight ball. And that is just a father wanting his son. Her resolve hardened. She slid the bar back. The sound was deafeningly loud, a screech of wood that seemed to make every warrior outside flinch. Holding the lamp high, she opened the door a crack. The cold night air rushed in, smelling of dust and pine and the faint metallic scent of blood. She held the lamp out, letting the light fall on her own face. She made sure her hands were empty, open. She met the chief's gaze across the clearing. She did not speak. She simply stood there, a lone woman in a doorway, bathed in lamplight, a silent plea and a defiant statement, all in one. Nantan took a single step forward, his eyes narrowing. He was reading her, judging her. He barked a short, sharp command. 2 of his warriors moved from the shadows, their rifles held at the ready, and began a slow, deliberate approach to the cabin. Abigail's blood ran cold, but she held her ground. She did not retreat. She did not close the door. She stood firm, the lamp shaking slightly in her hand. The 2 warriors stopped 10 feet from the door, flanking it. They were young, their faces taut with suspicion. They peered past her into the cabin's interior. Their eyes widened as they saw the small, blanket-wrapped figure by the fire. One of them spoke a harsh, guttural question. Abigail didn't understand the word, but the meaning was clear. "What have you done to him?" Before she could even think of a response, a gesture, anything. The boy on the floor cried out again, a delirious, fevered sound. "Taza!" He called his own name. Then he coughed a racking, painful sound. The two warriors exchanged a look. Their aggression was now mingled with concern. One of them glanced back at his chief. Nantan took another step forward. He was close enough now that she could see the lines of exhaustion and grief etched around his eyes. This wasn't the fearsome spectre of frontier legend. This was a father in anguish. He spoke his voice low and rumbling, not with anger, but with a desperate command. He pointed a long, calloused finger, not at Abigail, but at the boy. Abigail understood. He wanted to see his son. She took a slow, deliberate step back into the cabin, leaving the door wide open. It was an invitation, an act of trust so profound it felt like insanity. She was inviting the fox into the henhouse, but her chickens were already dead. What more did she have to lose? She returned to the fire, turning her back on the open door and the two armed warriors. She knelt by Taza, dipping a clean rag into the now warm willow bark tea. She gently dabbed the boy's forehead. He was burning up. She felt their presence behind her before she heard them. The two warriors stepped just inside the doorway, their moccasins silent on the floorboards. They smelled of leather and sweat and the cold night air. The barrels of their rifles were pointed at the floor, a small but significant sign of de-escalation. Their eyes were fixed on the boy. Then Nantan filled the doorway. His sheer size and presence seemed to suck the air from the small cabin. He ducked his head to enter his gaze, immediately locking onto his son. He moved past Abigail, as if she were a piece of furniture, his focus absolute. He knelt on the other side of the fire, his movements fluid and powerful. He reached out a hand not to touch the boy, but to hover it just over his forehead, feeling the heat radiating from him. A low sound, a growl of pain and sorrow escaped his throat. He looked at the crudely bandaged wound on Taza's leg. He gently touched the cloth, his expression unreadable. Then his dark eyes lifted and met Abigail's. For the first time, they were close enough to see each other, not as symbols, settler and savage, but as people. He saw the exhaustion in her face, the genuine concern. She saw the raw paternal fear in his. He spoke a single word, his voice, a gravelly question. He pointed from the boy's leg to the door, and then made a motion with his hands like snapping jaws. "Wolves," Abigail nodded her throat tight. "Yes," she whispered, the English word useless, but the affirmation clear. "Wolves." She pointed to her own rifle still on the table. She made a motion of firing it into the air, then waved her hands, shooing away imaginary beasts. She pointed to the boy, then to the cabin, trying to convey the act of rescue. Nantan watched her crude pantomime, his expression unchanging. Did he believe her? Or did he think she was a lying witch who had somehow injured his son, and now concocted a story he spoke to his warriors in their own language? The two men replied, their voices low. They were reporting what they had seen, the single set of her tracks mingled with the boy's leading from the arroyo, the wolf tracks scattered by a running human. They were telling him that her story, as much as they could piece it together, fit the evidence on the ground. As if on cue, a new sound intruded from the darkness outside, a distant rhythmic metallic clatter. It was faint, carried on the wind. Hoofbeats, shod horses, not the unshod ponies of the Apache. One of the warriors outside the cabin let out a low whistle. One of the men in the doorway melted back into the night. Nantan's head tilted, listening intently. The hoofbeats were growing steadily louder. a group of riders moving at a steady pace, heading directly towards her claim. Nantan's eyes met Abigail's again. This time the look was different. It was no longer just suspicion of her. It was a new, shared threat. He knew, as she did, that the only other white men who would be riding through this territory in the dead of night were not farmers or priests. They were men who hunted, and sometimes they hunted men. He rose to his full height and issued a series of quiet, rapid-fire commands to the warrior who remained. The man nodded and vanished. Outside, the silent ring of warriors dissolved back into the landscape, becoming one with the rocks and shadows. In seconds, it was as if they had never been there. Only Nantan remained a grim pillar of resolve inside her cabin. He looked from his sick son to the door, then at Abigail. He had made a decision. For now, the white woman's cabin was not a trap. It was cover, and the enemy of his enemy was for a terrifying and uncertain moment a potential ally. The riders were getting closer. The rhythmic beat of shod horses grew from a distant annoyance to an approaching threat. There were at least 4 of them, maybe more. They were moving with the lazy confidence of men who believed they owned the night. Abigail's stomach twisted. Prospectors wouldn't be out this late. A patrol from Fort Bowie would be larger and move with more discipline. These were irregulars, scrappers, the kind of men who thrived in the grey areas between law and lawlessness. Nantan stood by the window, a sliver of curtain pulled back his profile, as stark and unforgiving as the mountains outside. He was no longer a grieving father, but a commander assessing a battlefield. He gestured for Abigail to douse the main lamp. She complied immediately, plunging the cabin into the flickering, shadowy light of the hearth alone. "Who are they?" she whispered, though she knew he wouldn't understand the words. He glanced at her, then made a gesture, rubbing his thumb and forefinger, together the universal sign for money. Then he drew a finger across his throat. Bounty. The meaning was brutally clear. The riders reined in their horses just at the edge of the clearing, the same spot where Nantan had stood. Abigail crept to the other window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. In the moonlight she could make out 5 men. They were hard-looking, dressed in a motley collection of worn dusters and military surplus. They carried repeating rifles and had pistols belted high on their waists. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a thick, dark beard, sat his horse with a proprietary slump. This was Silas Thorne, a man whose name was spoken with a mixture of fear and contempt in Tucson. A former soldier cashiered for brutality, he had found a more profitable and less regulated line of work, hunting Apaches for the unofficial bounties paid for scalps. He and his crew were vultures, drawn by the scent of conflict. They must have seen the Apache's trail, or perhaps even seen the warriors gathering, and followed anticipating a massacre they could profit from. "Hello, the cabin!" Thorne's voice boomed, falsely jovial. It was the voice of a man used to getting what he wanted through intimidation disguised as courtesy. Abigail froze. Nantan shot her a look, a silent order. "Do not answer." "No need to be shy, ma'am," Thorne called again. "We saw the savages skulking around your place. Figured you might be in a spot of trouble. Name's Silas Thorne. We're here to help." His words were poisonously sweet. Help? He meant he was here to kill the Apaches, and if she was in the way, that was just a damn shame. Nantan pointed to the floor next to the hearth, to the darkest corner of the cabin. A clear instruction for her to hide the boy. The feverish Taza was barely conscious, a dead weight in her arms, as she dragged him and the blanket into the shadows behind a stack of firewood. He whimpered softly. "There's a child in here," Abigail hissed at Nantan, her voice trembling with a desperate urgency. "A sick child. They can't—" Nantan put a finger to his lips, his eyes burning with an intensity that silenced her more effectively than a hand over her mouth. He knew exactly what they were, better than she did. "Come on now, little lady." Another voice called out, this one higher-pitched and nervous. It belonged to a weaselly-looking man she now saw at Thorn's side, a man called Miller. "We just want to make sure you're all right. Old Nantan's band has been raising hell from here to the Mexican border. Wouldn't want you to be their latest victim." They knew his name. They were hunting him specifically. Thorn dismounted his boots, crunching on the gravelly soil. He handed his reins to another man and began to walk towards the cabin, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "I'm coming in," Thorn announced, not a request, but a statement of fact. "If you're alive, Ma'am, you best say something. If you're not, well, we'll say a prayer for your soul before we burn these red devils out." This was the moment, the pivot upon which everything would turn. Abigail looked at Nantan. His hand was now on the hilt of a long knife at his belt. His body was coiled like a spring. If Thorn came through that door, he would be met with a silent, lethal fury. But then what the other 4 men outside would riddle the cabin with bullets. She and the boy would be caught in the crossfire. She had to choose. She could let them in, betray Nantan, and pray they were merciful. A fool's prayer. Or she could trust the Apache chief, the man who an hour ago, she believed, had come to kill her, and stand with him against the men of her own race. Her gaze fell on Taza, shivering in the corner. His life depended on the next 30 seconds. Abigail took a breath and made her choice. She walked to the door, her own Winchester, now back in her hands. "I'm fine." She called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Thorn, but I'm all right. You should be on your way." There was a moment of silence from outside. Thorn stopped 10 feet from the door. "That you talkin', ma'am, or is one of them Injuns got a knife to your throat?" Miller piped up. "It's me." Abigail said, her voice, louder now, laced with an annoyance she didn't have to feign. "I saw a coyote skulking around and I fired a shot to scare it off. That's all. Now this is private property. I'd thank you to leave." Thorn chuckled a low, ugly sound. "A coyote, ma'am, we've been tracking a war party of at least a dozen Chiricahua for the last 5 miles. Their tracks lead right to this cabin. Now I'm going to ask you one more time to open this door, for your own good." He was testing her, trying to break her nerve. Nantan had moved to stand beside the door, flattened against the wall, his knife now in his hand. He was an unseen, deadly presence. He watched Abigail, his expression a mixture of surprise and grudging respect. This was not how he expected the white woman to react. "I heard no war party." Abigail lied, her heart pounding. "And I won't be opening my door to armed strangers in the middle of the night. If you've a complaint, you can file it with the marshal in Tucson. Good night." She put a finality in her tone that she hoped would be convincing. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind. "Stubborn bitch," Thorn muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. He turned back to his men. "All right, boys. Looks like she's either dead or in league with them. Don't matter much either way. The bounty's the same." Abigail's blood went cold. He wasn't going to leave. He was going to attack. "Miller," Thorn commanded. "You and Jake circle round back. See if there's a window. The rest of you with me. We're gonna knock." She heard their footsteps, splitting up, crunching in the dirt as they moved to surround the cabin. They were treating this not as a rescue, but as a siege. Nantan looked at Abigail. He pointed to the window she stood near, then to the other window across the room. He then pointed to himself and the door. He was assigning fields of fire. In that simple, desperate moment, an alliance was forged, not in words, but in shared peril. Abigail moved to the front window, resting the barrel of the Winchester on the sill. She peered out. Thorn and one other man were taking cover behind her water trough, their rifles glinting in the moonlight. She could hear Miller and Jake creeping through the brush at the rear of the cabin. Nantan was a ghost. He had melted into the shadows beside the door, the blade of his knife catching a faint glimmer of firelight. He was waiting for the breach. The boy Taza let out another feverish cry from his corner. It was a weak sound, but in the tense silence, it was as loud as a bell. Outside, Thorn heard it. "Hear that sounds like they got a little one in there with her. A captive." He spat on the ground. "All right, no more games. On my count, light 'em up." Abigail braced herself. The flimsy log walls of her home, once a fortress against the wilderness, now felt as thin as paper. She was trapped between two worlds, allied with a man she should fear against men she should trust. The harsh, unforgiving logic of the frontier had been turned on its head. There were wolves outside her door again, but this time they walked on two legs, and a far greater wolf was already inside. "One!" Thorn's voice cut through the night. Abigail's knuckles were white on the stock of her rifle. Her world had shrunk to the small rectangle of the window frame, and the two shapes crouched behind her water trough. Tour. She could hear the faint scuffling sound of Miller and his partner positioning themselves at the back of the cabin. She risked a glance at Nantan. He was utterly still, a predator conserving every ounce of energy for the killing blow. He met her gaze for a fraction of a second, and in his eyes she saw no fear, only a cold, hard calculation. 3. The world exploded in sound and violence. Thorn and his man opened fire, the roar of their rifles deafening. Bullets slammed into the front of the cabin. One punched through the wooden door with a splintering crack passing inches from Nantan's head. Another shattered the precious glass of Abigail's main window, showering her with fragments. She flinched back, a sharp sting on her cheek, telling her she'd been cut. Simultaneously, the two men at the back began firing at the rear wall. They weren't aiming to kill, not yet. This was suppressive fire designed to terrorize, to pin them down. Abigail pressed herself against the wall beside the now shattered window, the smell of gunpowder thick in her throat. This was it. The abstract threat had become a storm of lead and splintered wood. Nantan acted. He didn't return fire. He knew with a warrior's instinct that this was just the overture. The real attack would be a charge. He pointed at Abigail, then at the window, then held up one finger. He was telling her to hold her fire, to wait for a clear shot, to make it count. The initial volley subsided. In the ringing silence that followed, Thorn's voice called out again. "That was just a taste, you Apache lover. Throw the boy out and we might let you live." A cough came from the corner. "Taza." The sound was weak, but it was a reminder of what was at stake. Nantan moved with silent, fluid grace to the rear of the cabin. He pressed his ear against the logs, listening. He could hear the two men outside whispering, reloading. He looked back at Abigail and pointed to the rear wall, then held up two fingers. "Two men. My problem." He then pointed to the front window. "The others are yours." The responsibility fell on her like a physical weight. She crept back to the window, peering through the jagged hole where the pain had been. Thorn and his man were still behind the trough, but they were preparing to move. Suddenly, a new element entered the fray. A single arrow, black-fletched and silent, arched out of the darkness from the direction of the arroyo. It flew with incredible speed and buried itself deep in the wood of the water trough, inches from Thorn's head. Thorn yelped and flattened himself, cursing. "Where did that come from? I thought we saw them all go in the cabin." Nantan's warriors. They hadn't fled. They had melted into the landscape, waiting for their chief's signal or for an opportunity. They were out there, a phantom presence tipping the scales. The arrow had been a distraction. On the other side of the cabin, Miller decided it was time to force the issue. With a yell, he charged the back window, a small shuttered opening used for ventilation. He intended to smash it in and fire blindly into the cabin. He never made it. As his silhouette appeared at the opening, Nantan moved. He was not a man, but a blur of motion. He didn't use a weapon. He grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from its hook by the hearth. In one powerful fluid movement, he swung it. The skillet connected with the side of Miller's head through the opening with a sickening, wet crunch. Miller let out a single choked gasp and dropped out of sight, his rifle clattering to the ground. The other man at the back, Jake, shouted in alarm, "Miller, Miller, you hit!" There was no answer. Jake fired a panicked shot through the window, the bullet thudding harmlessly into the ceiling. This was the opening Thorn had been waiting for. Thinking the occupants were distracted by the fight at the rear, he and his remaining man broke cover, charging the front door. "Now!" he roared. This was Abigail's moment. She brought the Winchester to her shoulder, took a steadying breath, and lined up her sights on the second man, the one running slightly behind Thorn. She didn't aim for his chest. She aimed for his leg. She was a defender, not a murderer. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The man screamed, his leg collapsing under him as he tumbled to the ground, clutching a shattered knee. He was out of the fight. Thorn, however, was a different breed. He didn't even glance at his fallen comrade. He was a man, possessed his face, a mask of fury. He reached the door and slammed his heavy boot into it. The wood, already weakened, splintered around the lock. Nantan was there to meet him. As the door flew inward, Thorn charged in his pistol raised. But he was expecting a cowering woman or a cornered Indian. He was not expecting the Apache chief to be waiting for him, coiled and ready. Nantan didn't meet the charge head-on. He sidestepped, letting Thorn's momentum carry him past. As Thorn stumbled off balance, Nantan brought the edge of his hand down in a vicious chop on Thorn's wrist. Bones snapped. The pistol clattered to the floor. Thorn bellowed in pain and rage, spinning around his good hand, reaching for the massive bowie knife on his belt. He was bigger than Nantan, broader, and heavier, a brawler, fueled by hate. The two men crashed together in the center of the small cabin. It was a brutal, primal fight. They slammed against the table, sending it, and Abigail's rifle flying. They wrestled for position, grunting and cursing the firelight, casting their struggling forms as monstrous shadows on the walls. Abigail scrambled for her rifle, her hands shaking, but she couldn't get a clear shot. They were a whirlwind of limbs, locked in a deadly embrace. Outside, the man with the shattered knee was screaming. The one called Jake was firing blindly from the back of the house, his nerve broken. From the darkness, another arrow flew, silencing Jake with a thud and a choked cry. Nantan's warriors were methodically cleaning up the perimeter. The fight was now confined to the cabin. Thorn, using his superior weight, managed to slam Nantan against the wall, his thick forearm pressing against the chief's throat. Nantan's face began to darken, his eyes bulging. His hand scrabbled at Thorn's arm, trying to break the chokehold. Thorn grinned, his face inches from Nantan's. "Die, you red bastard!" he rasped, spittle flying from his lips. Abigail saw her chance. Taza the boy was watching from his corner, his eyes wide with terror. Not for himself, but for his father. The sight of the boy's face galvanized her. She wouldn't let him see his father die. She couldn't shoot, but Thomas had left more than one weapon. By the hearth was a set of heavy iron fireplace tools. She grabbed the poker, its tip still warm from the embers. It was heavy solid in her hands. With a cry that was part fear and part fury, she lunged forward. She swung the poker with all her strength, not at Thorn's head, but at the back of his thigh, the same leg she'd seen him favor when he dismounted. The iron bar connected with a solid thwack. Thorn roared in agony as his leg buckled the one supporting all his weight. His chokehold on Nantan loosened for just a second. It was all the chief needed. Nantan exploded upwards, breaking the hold. He drove his head forward like a battering ram into Thorn's face. There was a sickening crunch of cartilage and bone. Thorn staggered back, blood pouring from his shattered nose, his eyes dazed. Nantan did not hesitate. He drew the long knife from his belt. The blade flashed once in the firelight. Thorn's eyes went wide with disbelief, a gurgling sound escaping his lips. He looked down at the knife buried to the hilt just below his ribs. He took one more stumbling step backward, then crashed to the floor, his dead eyes staring at the ceiling. Silence. The only sounds were Abigail's ragged gasps, the crackle of the fire, and the soft, terrified whimpers of the boy in the corner. Nantan stood over the body of his enemy, his chest heaving. Blood from Thorn's nose was smeared across his cheek. He looked at the dead man, then at the knife in his hand, then at Abigail, who stood frozen, the heavy iron poker still clutched in her hands. The battle was over. The immediate threat was gone. But now, a new uncertain quiet descended. She, a white woman, had fought and killed alongside an Apache chief. They were allies bound by the blood they had just spilled. But what were they now in the aftermath? The dead man on her floor was a white man. By the law of the territory, she was now a criminal, an accomplice to murder. She had saved Nantan's life, but she may have just forfeited her own. The silence in the aftermath was heavier than the gunfire had been. It was thick with the smell of blood, sweat, and spent gunpowder. The body of Silas Thorn lay sprawled on her floorboards, a grotesque new centerpiece for her home. Outside, the world had gone quiet again. Nantan's warriors had been ruthlessly efficient. Nantan stood, his chest rising and falling, the adrenaline of combat slowly draining away. He pulled his knife from Thorn's body with a soft, wet sound and wiped it clean on the dead man's own duster. He then turned his attention not to Abigail, but to his son. He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt beside Taza. He spoke in low, gentle tones in their native tongue, his voice a stark contrast to the violence of moments before. He touched the boy's forehead, his expression softening with concern. Taza, who had watched the entire brutal fight with wide, terrified eyes, finally let his composure break. He began to cry, not loudly, but with the deep, shuddering sobs of a child who had seen too much. Nantan pulled him into his arms, wrapping the wool blanket tighter around him, murmuring words of comfort. Abigail watched the iron poker slipping from her nerveless fingers and clattering to the floor. She was an observer in her own home, a foreigner in her own life. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. The world she had known, the simple, lonely existence of a homesteader, was gone forever. In its place was this new reality forged in blood and a shared, desperate fight for survival. After a long moment, Nantan looked up at her over his son's head, his eyes which had held suspicion and then a warrior's cold focus now held something new and complex. It was not gratitude, not yet. It was a kind of deep, solemn acknowledgement, a recognition of a debt. He gave a quiet command, and one of his warriors appeared in the doorway. The man was uninjured, his face an impassive mask, but his eyes darted from the dead body of Thorn to Abigail, then back to his chief. They exchanged a few quiet words. The warrior nodded and disappeared. A few minutes later, 2 more Apaches entered the cabin. Without a word, they grabbed Thorn's body by the arms and legs and dragged it outside. Another came in and began collecting the weapons of the fallen bounty hunters, Thorn's pistol, Miller's rifle. They were sanitizing the scene, erasing the evidence of the fight with a practiced efficiency that spoke of long experience. Abigail simply stood, leaning against the wall for support, her legs trembling. She felt a sharp sting on her cheek and raised a hand to it. Her fingers came away bloody, a shard from the shattered window. Nantan noticed. He laid Taza gently back down, the boy's sobs having subsided into exhausted sleep. He walked over to Abigail. He was close enough now for her to see the fine lines around his eyes, the flecks of grey in his dark hair. He was not the monster of whispered tales, but a man aged by war and responsibility. He reached out not to touch her, but to point at the cut on her cheek. He said a single word, a question. Abigail just shook her head, a gesture that meant it's nothing in any language. He looked around the cabin at the destruction. The splintered door, the shattered window, the bullet holes peppering the walls, the bloodstains slowly seeping into her floorboards. He knew the cost of this night for her. He had brought this war to her doorstep. He walked to the doorway and looked out into the pre-dawn light. The sky was beginning to pale in the east, turning from inky black to a soft, bruised grey. His warriors were gathering their own. One was being carried, his leg bound tightly, the man she had shot in the knee. Another had a crude bandage around his arm. They had not escaped unscathed. They were also recovering the bodies of Thorn's men, preparing to take them far away from here, to leave no trace for a posse to follow. Nantan turned back to Abigail. He looked her directly in the eye. He placed his fist over his heart, a gesture of sincerity, of a promise made. Then he pointed to her, to the cabin, to the land. He swept his hand in a wide circle, encompassing the mountains, the arroyo, everything. Then he shook his head, a clear, sharp negative. He was telling her that she and this place would be safe, that his people would never trouble her again. More than that, he was placing her under his protection. Any threat that came to this small patch of land would be considered a threat to him. It was the only payment he could offer. It was a gift of immense value, and also an immense burden. He then went back to his son. Taza's fever was still high. Nantan lifted the boy into his arms as easily as if he were a bundle of sticks. The warriors outside had brought their ponies closer. One was brought for the chief. As he was about to leave, Nantan paused in the doorway. He turned one last time to face Abigail. He reached up and from his own hair untied a small thin leather thong from which hung a single perfect eagle feather. It was dark, banded with white, a symbol of great honor, courage, and sacred power. He held it out to her. Abigail hesitated, then slowly reached out and took it. Her rough, calloused fingers brushed against his. The feather was light, almost weightless, but it felt as heavy as a stone. It was a token, a treaty, a story that no one else would ever understand. He gave her a final brief nod, then turned and strode out into the dawn. She watched as he mounted his pony, his sick son held securely in front of him. The small band of warriors formed up around him, and without a backward glance, they rode away, not into the mountains, but down toward the flatlands, moving with a purpose. They would have a healer in their main camp who could tend to Taza's wound far better than she could. Abigail stood in her ruined doorway, the cool morning air washing over her. She watched until they were just small specks on the horizon, swallowed by the vastness of the land. Then they were gone. She was alone again, truly alone in the profound silence of the morning. Her chickens were dead, her cabin was a wreck, and a dark stain marked her floor. She was no longer just Abigail Hayes, the grieving widow. She was a woman who had sheltered an Apache boy, fought alongside his father, and killed a man of her own kind. She was an ally to the ghosts of the canyons. She looked down at the eagle feather in her hand. It was a secret she would have to carry for the rest of her life, a symbol of a night when all the rules of her world had been broken, and in the ensuing chaos she had found not madness, but a strange and terrifying kind of grace. The sun crested the Dragoon Mountains, flooding her small, broken piece of the world with light. It felt less like a sunrise, and more like the beginning of a new, uncertain and dangerous chapter. The ghosts of the territory were no longer just memories of her husband. They now had a name and a face, and she owed them a debt just as they owed one to her. In the heart of the unforgiving West survival was a matter of lines drawn in the sand settler versus native law versus outlaw us versus them. But on one violent night, a lone woman named Abigail Hayes erased those lines with an act of courage and redrew them in blood, trust, and a shared enemy. Her story isn't just a tale of the frontier. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest threats don't come from who we fear, but from who we resemble. And sometimes humanity is found in the most unexpected of alliances. If this story of the unforgiving West moved you, and if you believe that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it, then please help us share these stories. Hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a real story of grit and drama, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the frontier. Let us know in the comments. What would you have done in Abigail's place?